Common knowledge and conventional wisdom about much of history are often woefully lacking in actual knowledge and wisdom. For example, the Aztecs did not confuse the Spanish conquistadors with gods, nor did ninjas in feudal Japan have a blood feud against the samurai, and there is no basis in fact for the commonly accepted notion that the American Mafia traditionally stayed away from dealing drugs. Following are 20 things about these and other ways that many people picture history wrong. Alexander the Great did not conquer history's then greatest empire. Alexander the Great, one of history's greatest conquerors, is widely credited with conquering history's greatest empire until then. Alexander was undoubtedly great, but his empire's size was not the greatest to date. When Alexander died in 323 BC, history's largest empire until then was still the Persian Empire. The map above is of Alexander's empire at its greatest extent. The map below is of the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Darius the Great 490 BC. Alexander's and Darius' empires mostly overlap. However, the territory that Darius did not rule in Greece and Thrace is more than made up for with territories he ruled in Arabia, Central Asia, Libya and the Caucasus, that Alexander never conquered. All in all, the difference amounts to about 300,000 square kilometers, in favor of the Persian Empire at its peak, 5.5 million square kilometers, versus 5.2 million for Alexander's realm. It took another 2.5 centuries after Alexander's death before the Achaemenid Empire's size record was finally bested by China under the Han dynasty. Did the Roman Empire fall in 476 AD? 476 AD is often viewed as the traditional end date for the Western Roman Empire. However, the end of the empire was a gradual process, not an abrupt one. Contemporaries hardly noticed that anything special had happened in 476. What did actually happen that year was that a military strongman, Odoacer, beat another military strongman, Orestes, to become the power behind the throne. Western Roman emperors, having long since been reduced to puppets by then. Odoacer then forced Orestes' son, the 16-year-old Emperor Romulus Augustulus, to abdicate. Augustulus' imperial regalia was then sent to the other Roman emperor in Constantinople, who confirmed Odoacer as ruler of Italy in the now sole Roman emperor's name. On the ground, little changed in Italy or the rest of the Western Roman Empire. Most people who lived in 477 would not have noticed anything particularly different from 476. Did the Aztecs think the Spanish conquistadors were gods? It is often bandied about that the Spanish defeat of the Aztecs was helped by the natives' belief that Hernán Cortés and his men were gods. That is false. The Aztecs were extremely religious and had many weird notions, but they were not so idiotically so as to believe that the conquistadors were gods. The Aztec Emperor Montezuma II was fully aware that the Spaniards were humans who came from far away. Indeed, Montezuma was sufficiently informed so as to know that Hernán Cortés was not acting with the consent of his king, Charles V. Charles I of Spain. The Aztec ruler even tried to go over Cortés' head by attempting to negotiate directly with King Charles. He failed, but it is clear that Montezuma knew that he was dealing with people, not gods. Real-life ninjas were nothing like their depiction in popular culture. The word ninja often evokes images of masked warriors, all in black, scaling building walls and assassinating people all over feudal Japan. In modern popular culture, people think of ninjas as covert killers, using exotic blades, throwing stars and smoke bombs to carry out assassinations, and locked in a feud with the more honorable samurai. In reality, those kinds of super cool ninjas never existed. The ones who did exist looked and acted nothing like popular perceptions thinks ninjas looked like and acted. Far from having any feud with the samurai, many ninjas were actually samurai. Samurai ninjas. According to the best available historical evidence, ninjas did not go around in black outfits as part of a group uniform getup. At least no more than the average Japanese people of the period wore black clothes. What we consider ninjas were simply scouts, spies and mercenaries, hired by various armies in feudal Japan to carry out their tasks. They blended into the local population. They did not use throwing stars, but did use thrown poison darts known as bow shurikens. They did not have a blood feud with samurai. Indeed, there was nothing to prevent a samurai from being a ninja, and quite a few ninjas were actually samurai. Did the American Mafia stay away from drugs? Charles Lucky Luciano was a visionary crime mafia boss who founded today's Genovese crime family, one of New York City's 5 mafia families. He is also credited with establishing the Commission, a committee running the Italian-American Mafia and arbitrating its internal disputes, to avert bloody struggles disruptive to business. Lucky Luciano is considered the founding father of the Italian-American Mafia, and the key architect who created modern American organized crime as we know it. He was also America's biggest drug dealer. The modern mob's founder was a narcotics kingpin. A criminal since childhood, Charles Lucky Luciano emigrated to America at age 9. By age 10 he was involved in shoplifting, mugging and extortion. At age 19 Luciano was sentenced to 6 months for selling heroin. In 1920 he joined Joe Masseria's crime family and became his chief lieutenant, running his bootlegging, prostitution and narcotics operations. Indeed, Lucky Luciano became America's biggest narcotics trafficker and distributor, contra the notion popularized by movies and works of fiction that the mob traditionally avoided narcotics. Dealing drugs was one of the Mafia's biggest moneymakers since the earliest days of the American Mafia. A godfather and narcotics trafficker. It is often asserted that the Mafia had a long-standing prohibition against drug trafficking, either because of morality or because of the public stigma attached to drugs. That is bunk. The notion that the Mafia stayed away from drugs is just a myth, popularized by fiction and Hollywood hits such as The Godfather. In reality, the Mafia was heavily involved in the drug trade from the start, long before the days of Pablo Escobar. Pioneering mafioso Lucky Luciano became America's and one of the world's biggest narcotics kingpins. For decades the Mafia was the biggest importer of hard drugs into the U.S., particularly heroin. It was not until cocaine supplanted heroin as the hard drug of choice, and the rise of the Colombian cartels in the 1970s, that the mob lost its top billing as America's biggest drug trafficker. World War II's heaviest bomber was an American. When we picture World War II bombers raining destruction down on the Third Reich in Japan, what usually comes to mind are iconic famous American heavy bombers, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator and the B-29 Superfortress. However, the war's heaviest bomber and the one which dropped the most tonnage was not American. It was the British Royal Air Force's Avro Lancaster. The Lancaster was Britain's most successful bomber of World War II, first flown in 1941 and entering operational service in February of 1942. It became the mainstay of Britain's strategic bombing campaign. It displaced the RAF's other heavy bombers, the Halifax and Stirling. To become Britain's principal bomber in the second half of the war, Lancasters carried 64% of the tonnage dropped by Bomber Command during the conflict. They could also carry the heaviest payload of the war, at 22,000 pounds, exceeding the 20,000-pound maximum payload of the bigger and more advanced B-29, an airplane twice as heavy as the Lancaster. A big British beast. RAF Bomber Command preferred Lancasters over Britain's other mainstay heavy bomber, the Handley Page Halifax. Unlike the Halifax, whose bomb bay was compartmentalized, thus limiting the size of the individual bombs it could carry, the Lancaster had a long and unobstructed bomb bay that allowed Lancasters to carry the RAF's biggest bombs, such as the 4,000-pound Cookie and 12,000-pound Tall Boy. Specially modified Lancasters could also carry the 22,000-pound Grand Slam, the heaviest payload of any World War II bomber. Explosives and fire, a 1-2 bombing punch. Lancasters typically carried a mix of large high-explosive bombs, such as 2,000-pound bombs or 4,000-pound and heavier blockbusters, plus clusters of smaller incendiary bombs. The idea was that the big bombs would tear open buildings. Then the incendiaries would start fires in their innards, which were now well ventilated. The blockbusters would hopefully have also ruptured the city's water mains, making firefighting difficult or impossible. That allowed individual fires to coalesce into larger conflagrations that, if conditions were ripe, could produce firestorms. When they occurred, firestorms produced hurricane-strength walls of flame and whirling tornadoes of fire that would sweep and dance through cities. They were capable of killing tens of thousands by burning them to cinders or, as the story's high inferno sucked the oxygen out of the air, suffocating those whom the flames did not touch. World War II precision bombing. By World War II standards, Lancasters were capable of great precision, equipped with ground-mapping radar. By 1944 they could bomb at night with higher accuracy than American bombers could during the day. In the run-up to D-Day, Lancasters accurately bombed communications and transportation targets such as bridges and rail yards. In addition to strategic bombing, Lancasters were used by 617 Squadron, the dam busters immortalized in the book and movie of the same name. 617 Squadron flew Lancasters in special operation aerial attacks, such as breaching the Ruhr dams in 1943. Lancasters flown by 617 Squadron also sank the battleship Tirpitz in 1944 with 12,000 pounds tall boys, and were used in Operation Manna towards the war's end, a mercy mission that dropped food into Holland to avert widespread starvation. The 19th century was rife with terrorism. We tend to think of political terrorism as a modern phenomenon, one that emerged in the 20th. In reality, political terrorism has roots going all the way back to ancient Judea, when Jewish radicals such as the Zealots and Sicarii engaged in widespread terrorism to free themselves from the Romans. Relatively more recently, modern political terrorism as we know it has its roots in the 19th century, when numerous radical groups set up shop and turned to violence in a bid to achieve political ends. One such was the Russian Empire's Narodnaya Volya or People's Will, an underground revolutionary organization. People's Will sought to overthrow Russia's Tsarist autocracy by acts of violent propaganda calculated to spark a mass revolt. They are best known for their assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, and for being the forerunners of even bigger and more effective anarchist and socialist organizations in the following decades. 19th century radical students. People's Will had its genesis in radical student study circles in the 1870s that sought to spread socialist ideas to peasants and industrial workers. They were soon repressed by the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, who swiftly arrested and jailed the agitators. That led to a consensus that only revolutionary violence could overthrow Tsarism, and the adoption of more clandestine and aggressive tactics, specifically propaganda, the deed, or terrorism. The result was Zemlya I Volya, Land and Liberty, a radical organization that advocated political assassinations as self-defense and justified revenge against oppressive officials. However, it stopped short of viewing terror as a means of political struggle against the government. People's Will splintered off from Zemlya I Volya when it was nearly wiped out by the secret police in 1879, following a failed assassination attempt on the Tsar. People's Will emerged from the wreckage. From the start, it was more radical and viewed terror as a proactive tool for overthrowing the regime, and not simply as a reactive means of retaliation. Painting a target on the Tsar's back. From the outset, People's Will called for violence and announced an ambitious program of terrorism and assassination to break the government, issued a proclamation declaring a death sentence against Tsar Alexander II, who was to be executed as an enemy of the people. The group established clandestine cells in major cities and within the Russian military, and began publishing underground revolutionary newspapers and leaflets targeted at industrial workers. People's Will tried to kill the Tsar in December of 1879 with explosives on a railway, but missed his train. They tried again 2 months later, planting a bomb in his palace, but he was not in the room when the explosives went off. A frightened Tsar declared a state of emergency and set up a commission to repress the terrorists. Within a week, a People's Will assassin attempted to kill the commission's head, amid mounting repression, including the hanging of People's Will activists caught distributing illegal leaflets. The group doggedly persisted with its relentless efforts to kill the Tsar. It is too early to thank God. On March 1, 1881, People's Will finally got their man, waiting at ambush along a route taken by the Tsar every week. A People's Will assassin threw a bomb under his carriage. The explosion killed a guard and wounded others, but the carriage was armored. The Tsar was unhurt, and the bomb thrower was captured. A shaken Tsar emerged from the carriage, and a second assassin concealed in the gathering crowd spotted him crossing himself as he surveyed the damage. Shouting, "It is too early to thank God," the assassin threw another bomb, this one landing and going off directly beneath the Tsar's feet. A third assassin lurked in the crowd, ready with yet another bomb if the first two had failed, but his explosives were unnecessary. The assassins were arrested and hanged, and in the aftermath intensified repression effectively crippled People's Will, as its members were rounded up and executed or jailed. Terrorism was kept in check for years, but the repression created even more enemies for the regime and drove more opponents into underground clandestine resistance. It transformed the Russian Empire into a pressure cooker that finally erupted into revolution in 1905, and into an even greater revolution that finally did away with Tsardom in 1917. Surviving veterans of People's Will, who began emerging from prisons at the turn of the century as their sentences expired, played important roles in both revolutions. Winston Churchill wanted to fight the USSR soon as Germany surrendered in World War II. The big three Allied leaders of World War II, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, were anything but a harmonious bunch. However, they stuck together long enough to beat their common enemies, before the pretense of amity finally collapsed, and things went from wartime friendship and warmth to Cold War wariness and hostility. In 1945, as World War II drew to a close in Europe, Churchill was exasperated by Soviet intransigence regarding Eastern Europe, which Stalin sought to transform into a Soviet empire. Britain had gone to war to defend Polish independence, but at the war's end, Stalin was riding roughshod over the Poles. He kept the third of Poland he had annexed in 1939 in cooperation with Hitler, and reduced what was left to a Soviet client state, lacking freedom and independence. Churchill saw it as a matter touching British honor, so he ordered his generals to draw up plans for an attack on the Soviets soon as Germany surrendered. The goal was to push them back to the USSR's borders, or at least force them to treat Poland fairly. An unthinkable proposition. Churchill's generals presented him with Operation Unthinkable, whose title indicates what they thought of the Prime Minister's idea. Two versions were offered, an offensive and a defensive one. The offensive envisaged a surprise attack on the Soviets in July 1945, intended to force Stalin to give Poland a fair deal. The defensive envisaged a British defense of Western Europe after America withdrew from the continent. The Soviets had 10 million men available in the summer of 1945. They outnumbered the British and Americans in Europe 4-1 in men, and 2-1 in tanks, and superior tanks at that. The Allies had an advantage in the air, but even that was subject to challenge, as the Red Air Force by 1945 had formidable fighter and ground attack arms. Moreover, the Soviet military by 1945 was not the hapless rabble it had been in 1941. When the Germans invaded, it had grown into a veteran and battle-hardened force that had won bigger campaigns against significantly greater opposition than the Allies had faced. No can do, Prime Minister. In a nutshell, Churchill's generals concluded that it would be ill-advised to attack the Soviets. Far from being a pushover, the Red Army in 1945 was dangerous, vicious, and very big. If war broke out, it was more likely to end with the Red Army conquering all of continental Europe, rather than getting chased back to the USSR. More importantly, the generals informed Churchill that Britain on her own stood no chance against the Soviets, and the US had no incentive to attack them, especially not over Poland and Eastern Europe. Standing up for Poland was a matter of honor for Churchill, but not many shared his views. Few in the British government, and fewer still in that of the US, thought Poland or Eastern Europe were worth an even greater war against the Soviet Union than the one they had just concluded against Germany. Unlike Britain, America had never guaranteed Poland's territorial integrity, nor had it entered World War II in order to defend Polish sovereignty. Presented with the proceeding, Churchill grudgingly let the matter drop, and Operation Unthinkable was archived. That time we passed tactical nukes around like Skittles. During the Cold War, the U.S. military deployed tactical nuclear warheads by the thousands. Alarmingly, those weapons, whose battlefield use during a conventional war could easily have escalated things into a nuclear Armageddon, were entrusted to personnel way down the chain of command. Basically, it was a situation where a jittery lieutenant, or even a corporal, could have kicked off a chain of events that concluded with the extinction of humanity. The Davy Crockett weapon system was a smoothbore recoilless rifle that fired a W-54 warhead, a tactical nuclear explosive with a yield of up to 1 kiloton. To put that in perspective, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had yields of 15 and 21 kilotons respectively. The M28 version of the Davy Crockett could fire its warhead up to a distance of 1.25 miles, while the later M29 version had a range of 2.5 miles. Developed in the 1950s, over 2,000 Davy Crockett's and their launch systems were deployed with U.S. ground forces in West Germany and Korea from 1961 to 1971.